What begins as a simple act of kindness, sharing sandwiches on a checkered blanket, suddenly turns into something extraordinary. Because this man isn't just lonely. He's hiding a past tied directly to her family. And when her little boy whispers a shocking secret, everything changes. Whispers of love stolen, lies buried, and a truth powerful enough to tear reputations apart or heal generations. Can a chance picnic turn strangers into family? Or will hidden wounds destroy the only hope they've ever had? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Ruth Ellison stood in her small kitchen early Saturday morning, the warm sunlight streaming through the window highlighting the dancing dust motes in the air. She opened her nearly empty pantry, mentally calculating how to create a special picnic lunch from what little they had. The food pantry box from church had been a blessing this week, even if it meant getting creative with meals. "Grandma, can I help?" 7-year-old Evie appeared beside her, already reaching for the loaf of bread on the counter. Her dark curls were neatly braided, thanks to Ruth's careful handiwork earlier that morning. "Of course, sweet pea. Would you like to be my sandwich artist?" Ruth smiled, pulling out a jar of peanut butter that was nearly scraped clean. "Me too, me too." Leo's eager voice piped up as he scrambled into the kitchen, his untied shoelaces trailing behind him. At 5 years old, he wanted to be involved in everything his big sister did. Ruth's heart swelled with love for her grandchildren. "There's plenty of work for everyone. Leo, you can help count out the graham crackers for dessert." She watched as Evie carefully spread peanut butter on the bread slices, her tongue sticking out in concentration. "Grandma, are we using the special jelly today?" Evie asked, referring to the homemade strawberry preserves their neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, had given them. "We sure are. Special treats for my special helpers." Ruth removed the small jar from the refrigerator, watching Leo count graham crackers with exaggerated precision. 1, 2, 3. He pointed to each cracker, sometimes counting the same one twice. "How about 6 crackers total, sunshine? 2 for each of us." Ruth gently guided his counting, making sure to keep her voice encouraging. The morning light grew stronger as they worked together, assembling their modest feast. Ruth added some carrot sticks from the food pantry box and filled their reusable water bottles. She found a slightly bruised apple in the fruit bowl and cut it carefully, avoiding the bad spots. "Look what I found!" Evie exclaimed, pulling their old checkered blanket from the hall closet. The fabric was worn thin in spots, but it was clean and still carried memories of countless family gatherings. "Perfect choice," Ruth nodded, tucking the last sandwich into their basket. A practical wicker container she'd found at a yard sale years ago. "Now, Leo, let's get those shoes tied properly before we head out." She knelt down, her knees protesting slightly, and helped Leo with his laces. "Over, under, around and through," they chanted together, practicing the rhyme she'd taught both children. The walk to the park was only a few blocks, but Ruth made sure they took their time. Leo stopped to examine interesting rocks and leaves, while Evie skipped ahead, always turning back to make sure they were following. "Remember to stay where I can see you," Ruth called out, adjusting the basket on her arm. The morning was pleasantly warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers from the nearby gardens. "Look, the swings are empty." Leo pointed excitedly as they entered the park, but Ruth shook her head with a gentle smile. "Lunch first, swings after. You need energy for all that playing." She scanned the park, looking for a good spot to set up their picnic. The old oak tree near the center of the park offered the perfect combination of shade and soft grass. As they made their way across the park, Evie helped spread out the blanket while Leo bounced on his toes, eager to start eating. Ruth smoothed out the wrinkles in the fabric, making sure each corner was secured with small rocks to prevent the breeze from lifting it. "Now, let's see what we have here," Ruth said warmly, beginning to unpack their simple feast. She arranged the sandwiches on paper napkins, making sure each serving looked special despite their humble ingredients. "The peanut butter and jelly ones are mine and Leo's," Evie announced proudly, pointing to the sandwiches she'd made herself. "I put extra jelly on his, 'cause that's his favorite." Ruth nodded approvingly. "You're such a thoughtful sister, Evie." And look how nicely you spread everything right to the edges." As she continued arranging their lunch, Evie suddenly tugged at her grandmother's sleeve. "Grandma," she whispered, though her whisper was still quite audible, "there's a man sitting all alone over there." Ruth glanced up briefly, noticing the solitary figure Evie had pointed out. He sat quietly on a nearby bench, his attention seemingly focused on the children playing in the distance. He was well dressed, but had an air of sadness about him that Ruth recognized from her own moments of loneliness. "Yes, I see him," Ruth acknowledged softly, turning her attention back to distributing the carrot sticks among their plates. "But right now, let's focus on our lunch. Leo, honey, would you like your sandwich cut into triangles or squares?" "Triangles," Leo declared, bouncing slightly where he sat. "They taste better that way." Ruth smiled, taking out the plastic knife she'd packed. She could feel Evie's attention still drawn to the mysterious man on the bench, but she kept her focus on creating their little celebration of simple pleasures. The graham crackers were arranged carefully on a napkin, the apple slices distributed evenly, and each water bottle placed within easy reach. The shade from the old oak tree dappled their blanket with shifting patterns of light and shadow, creating a peaceful atmosphere for their modest feast. Ruth took a moment to say a quick prayer of gratitude, both for the food before them and for the blessing of spending this time with her grandchildren. Leo tugged at Ruth's sleeve, his big brown eyes fixed on the man sitting alone. "Grandma, can we ask him to join us?" He looked sad. Ruth hesitated, studying the stranger on the bench. He wore simple but well-pressed khakis and a light blue button-down shirt that seemed a size too large. His silver hair was neatly combed, and though his posture was straight, there was something almost fragile about the way he sat there, hands folded in his lap. "I don't know, sweetheart," Ruth said softly. But before she could finish her thought, Leo had already broken free from her gentle grip. "Mister," Leo called out, waving his small hand, "would you like to share our picnic?" The man startled slightly at being addressed, his shoulders tensing. He glanced around as if to make sure the child was actually speaking to him. A gentle smile crossed his weathered face, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "That's very kind of you, young man," he replied, his voice quiet and measured. "But I wouldn't want to impose." "Please?" Evie chimed in, emboldened by her little brother's invitation. "Grandma always makes extra sandwiches." Ruth felt her heart soften at the children's earnest hospitality. There was something about the man's demeanor that put her maternal instincts at ease, a gentleness in his eyes that spoke of loneliness rather than threat. "We'd be happy to have you join us," Ruth offered, smoothing her worn cotton dress. "If you'd like." The man hesitated for a moment longer before slowly rising from his bench. He walked over with measured steps, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you," he said. "I'm Thomas." He didn't offer a last name, and Ruth didn't press for one. Leo immediately scooted over to make room on their checkered blanket. "I'm Leo, and that's my sister Evie, and this is our Grandma Ruth." Thomas carefully lowered himself onto the corner of the blanket. "It's nice to meet you all." Ruth began distributing the simple fare: peanut butter and jelly sandwiches cut into triangles, apple slices, and cookies she'd baked using the last of their flour. "It's not fancy," she apologized. "It's perfect," Thomas said quietly, accepting a sandwich half. "I can't remember the last time I had a proper picnic." As they ate, the initial awkwardness began to fade. Leo chatted animatedly about his favorite superhero comics, while Evie described the book she was currently reading. Thomas listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that drew bright smiles from both children. Ruth noticed how he seemed to savor each bite of the simple meal, as if it were something precious. His manners were impeccable, but there was nothing pretentious about him. When Leo dropped his cookie, Thomas quickly offered his own untouched one in exchange. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by the children's laughter and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Thomas shared a few careful stories about his time in the military, carefully edited for young ears, which had both kids hanging on every word. "Were you scared?" Leo asked, eyes wide. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." Ruth found herself nodding at his words, appreciating the gentle wisdom he offered. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows lengthened across the grass. Ruth began gathering the empty napkins and containers, helping the children shake crumbs from the blanket. Thomas rose to assist, carefully folding his corner of the checkered cloth. A woman walking past suddenly stopped, her face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Reed," she exclaimed. "I just wanted to thank you. The new children's reading garden is absolutely wonderful. My kids spend hours there now." Thomas's face flushed slightly as he nodded in acknowledgement. "I'm glad they're enjoying it," he murmured. Ruth's hands froze in the act of closing the picnic basket. Reed, Thomas Reed, the town's reclusive millionaire who'd inherited the Reed manufacturing fortune. The man who funded half the town's charitable projects but was rarely seen in public. She'd just shared her humble picnic lunch with one of the wealthiest men in the state. The woman continued down the path, and Thomas turned back to find Ruth staring at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite read. The easy comfort of their afternoon seemed to waver in the air between them. "Thank you for sharing your picnic," he said softly, taking a step back. "It was truly a pleasure." Ruth held Leo's small hand tightly as they walked home from the park, her mind still spinning from their unexpected encounter. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk of Pine Street, and Evie skipped a few steps ahead, humming a tune from her school choir. "He was nice," Leo said, looking up at his grandmother with those earnest eyes that always seemed to see right through to the heart of things. "Mr. Thomas shared his cookies with us." "That he did," Ruth replied carefully, remembering how the distinguished-looking stranger had pulled a small package of store-bought shortbread from his jacket pocket. Such a simple gesture. But there had been something almost wistful in the way he'd offered them to the children. "Did you see how he knew all about the different birds in the park, Grandma?" Evie turned around, walking backward for a few steps. "He told Leo and me about the cardinal families that live in the oak trees." Ruth nodded, adjusting the empty picnic basket on her arm. Thomas Reed. The name still echoed in her mind. Everyone in town knew of him, but few had ever met him in person. The Reed Foundation funded half the public works projects in their small community, yet its founder remained a mystery, a name on plaques and donation lists. When they reached their modest house on Maple Avenue, Ruth sent the children to wash up while she unpacked the basket. The afternoon's leftovers went into the refrigerator, 2 slightly squashed peanut butter sandwiches that would serve as tomorrow's lunch. She couldn't help but think about how Thomas Reed had eaten his portion with such genuine appreciation, as if it were fine dining instead of budget bread and bargain spread. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Ruth started dinner preparations, peeling potatoes for a simple soup. The children's voices drifted down from upstairs where they were playing, and the familiar sounds usually brought her comfort. But tonight, her thoughts kept drifting back to the park bench and the lonely millionaire who had seemed so grateful for a simple invitation to join their picnic. The doorbell rang just as Ruth was setting the soup to simmer. Through the screen door, she saw Jeffrey Wilson, the Reed Estate's manager, standing on her porch in his crisp business suit. Her heart skipped a beat. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not interrupting your evening." "Not at all," Ruth replied, though she kept one hand on the doorframe, uncertain. "Mr. Reed asked me to deliver this to you personally." He held out a cream-colored envelope, the paper thick and expensive. Looking in the porch light, he wanted to ensure it reached you tonight. Ruth accepted the envelope with slightly trembling fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Good evening, Mrs. Ellison." He nodded politely and turned to go, his polished shoes clicking down her worn porch steps. Inside, Ruth sat at her small kitchen table, the envelope seeming out of place next to the salt and pepper shakers she'd picked up at the dollar store. She opened it carefully, trying not to tear the fine paper. The note inside was handwritten in elegant script. "Dear Mrs. Ellison, please accept this small gesture of gratitude for sharing your afternoon with a lonely old man. I've taken the liberty of arranging for Evie and Leo's enrollment in the Summer Arts Academy program. All fees have been handled directly with the organization. Your grandchildren's kindness today meant more than you know. Sincerely, Thomas Reed." Ruth's vision blurred as she read the words again. The Summer Arts Academy. She'd seen the flyers at the children's school, but had put them straight out of her mind. The tuition for both children would have been more than a month's wages from her cafeteria job. "Grandma?" Evie's voice came from the doorway. "Is the soup ready?" Ruth quickly wiped her eyes. "Almost, sweetheart." "Go call your brother." Later that night, after the children were tucked in bed, Ruth sat in her favorite chair by the window. Her worn Bible lay open in her lap, and she carefully folded Thomas Reed's note between the pages of Psalms. The paper felt foreign there, like a silk ribbon marking cotton pages. She thought about Thomas Reed's gentle manner with the children, how his eyes had lit up when Leo showed him the toy car he'd brought to the park. There had been something almost familiar in his sadness, something that reminded her of her own lonely days after losing her husband, when a simple shared meal could feel like a lifeline. But why had he chosen to help them? Ruth's practical nature couldn't help but wonder what a wealthy man like Thomas Reed could want with a cafeteria worker's family. She'd learned long ago that nothing in life came truly free. Still, as she closed her Bible, Ruth couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her chest at the thought of telling the children they could attend the art camp they'd been dreaming about. Sometimes, she supposed, a kindness was just that. A kindness. The Sunday morning sun painted golden streaks across the park's worn benches as Ruth guided her grandchildren through their after-church routine. Leo bounded ahead in his freshly pressed blue shirt, while Evie walked more deliberately, careful not to scuff her patent leather shoes on the gravel path. "Slow down there, sunshine," Ruth called to Leo, her voice carrying the lingering warmth of morning hymns. The crisp autumn air held just enough chill to make their light jackets necessary. As they rounded the bend near their usual picnic spot, Ruth spotted a familiar figure on the bench, Thomas Reed, dressed in a well-tailored gray suit that spoke of quiet wealth. He seemed absorbed in something small he held in his hands. "Mr. Thomas," Leo's excited greeting made the older man start slightly. He quickly tucked whatever he'd been looking at into his pocket, but not before Evie's sharp eyes caught the glint of metal. "Good morning," Thomas said, standing with old-fashioned courtesy. "I hope you all had a blessed service?" "We did, thank you," Ruth replied, noting how his polite smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something heavy in his manner today, a weight that hadn't been there yesterday. Leo tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Can you tell us more bird stories, please?" "Now, Leo," Ruth began, but Thomas held up a gentle hand. "I'd be honored," he said. "That is, if your grandmother doesn't mind?" Ruth hesitated, then nodded. She spread their old checkered blanket on the grass while Thomas settled onto it with surprising ease for a man of his station. Leo immediately nestled close, eager for stories. Evie, however, remained standing, her gaze fixed on Thomas's pocket. "What's that shiny thing you were holding?" she asked with the direct curiosity of a 7-year-old. Thomas blinked, then slowly reached into his pocket. "This? It's just an old pocket watch, been in my family for generations." He pulled out a gleaming silver timepiece attached to a delicate chain. "May I see?" Evie asked, inching closer. Thomas hesitated for just a moment before holding it out. "Careful now, it's quite old." Evie handled the watch with unexpected gentleness, her small fingers tracing the intricate engravings on its case. As she turned it over, something slipped from behind the watch face. A weathered photograph, yellowed at the edges. "Oh, careful with that." Thomas reached for the photo, but Evie had already caught it. Her eyes widened. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice suddenly strange. "Grandma, look." Ruth leaned forward, wondering what had caused such a shift in her usually composed granddaughter. The photograph was old, maybe 15 years or so, showing a young woman in a gray maid's uniform standing on an elegant veranda. She was laughing at something off camera, her whole face lit up with joy. The picnic basket slipped from Ruth's suddenly nerveless fingers. "Maya," she breathed, barely aware she'd spoken aloud. Thomas's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on Ruth's trembling hands. The bright autumn morning seemed to freeze around them, the children's earlier laughter fading into a heavy silence. "You," Ruth's voice caught. "You knew my daughter?" The photograph quivered in Evie's grip, her mother's smile, preserved in time, looking out at them from a past Ruth thought she'd laid to rest. Thomas sat absolutely still, the color draining from his face as he stared at the image of Maya, beautiful and young, and so very alive, wearing the uniform of the Reed household. Leo, sensing the change in atmosphere, pressed closer to his grandmother. "Grandma, what's wrong?" But Ruth couldn't answer. Her eyes remained locked with Thomas's, both of them frozen in a moment of mutual shock and recognition, while Maya's radiant smile beamed up at them from the faded photograph. Holding secrets, neither of them seemed prepared to face. Thomas sat frozen, staring at the photograph in his open watch. His weathered fingers traced the edge of Maya's smiling face, while Ruth's hands twisted in her lap, her breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, sweet but fragile. Evie huddled closer to her grandmother, dark eyes wide with questions she didn't yet know how to ask. The autumn breeze rustled through the oak leaves above them, a whisper of secrets long buried. "I remember this day," Thomas said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Maya had just finished arranging flowers in the solarium. She always knew exactly how to make everything more beautiful. He swallowed hard. "The light was perfect, and I couldn't resist taking a picture." Ruth's lips trembled as she watched Leo, innocent and unaware of the weight of the moment, edge closer to Thomas. Her grandson's small sneakers left impressions in the grass as he moved, drawn by some invisible thread of recognition. "Mr. Thomas?" Leo's voice was bird, soft as he climbed onto Thomas's knee, seemingly unaware of the older man's startled intake of breath. "Can I see the picture?" Thomas held the watch so Leo could peek inside. The boy's finger touched the photograph gently. "That's my mommy," he said matter-of-factly. "She's pretty, isn't she?" "Yes," Thomas whispered. "She was very pretty." Ruth wanted to reach for Leo, to pull him back, but something held her still. The truth had been living in her heart for so long, weighing her down like river stones in her pockets. Now it was about to surface, brought forth by the innocent honesty of a child. Leo leaned in close to Thomas's ear, his small hand cupped as if sharing a precious secret. But his whisper carried clearly in the hushed park air. "Mommy says you're my daddy." The words fell like autumn leaves, gentle but impossible to catch and put back. Thomas's face drained of color, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped the watch. Evie gasped softly, pressing closer to Ruth, who felt the world tilting beneath her. For a long moment, no one spoke. A cardinal called from a nearby branch, oblivious to the earthquake of revelation happening below. Ruth found herself counting heartbeats, each one thundering in her ears like summer storm clouds rolling in. Finally, Thomas looked up, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Maya," he breathed her name like a prayer. We were in love." His voice cracked on the word. "It was secret at first. My mother wouldn't have. She didn't." He stopped, composing himself. Leo remained perched on his knee, studying Thomas's face with the pure curiosity of childhood. Ruth noticed how similar their eyes were, a detail she'd tried so hard not to see before. "She worked at the house for 2 years, Thomas continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "We fell in love slowly, carefully. I wanted to marry her, but then—" His face crumpled. "She disappeared. No note, no goodbye. My mother said she'd taken a better position in another state. I wrote letters, but they all came back unopened." Ruth's hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white with tension. She remembered those dark days, watching her daughter's heart break piece by piece, seeing the light fade from Maya's eyes as she protected the secret growing beneath her heart. "I never knew," Thomas said, looking directly at Ruth now, his voice thick with pain and wonder. "I never knew she was carrying my child. If I had—" He reached out tentatively toward Leo, then pulled back, overwhelmed. "My God, if I had known." Leo, still innocent of the adult's turmoil, patted Thomas's cheek with a small hand. "Don't be sad," he said. "Mommy always smiled when she talked about you. Before she went to heaven." Thomas made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. His eyes met Ruth's, filled with devastation at all the lost years, all the memories he'd never have. But there was something else there, too, a desperate longing, a hope he hardly dared to voice. Ruth saw in that moment how the truth would change everything. For her grandchildren, for Thomas, for their whole small world. The weight of it pressed against her chest, but somehow it felt lighter than the burden of silence she'd carried for so long. The cardinal called again, its bright song cutting through the heavy silence. Above them, the oak leaves continued their ancient dance, witnesses to yet another story unfolding beneath their branches. Ruth's small house felt both empty and suffocating as she closed the front door behind her. The children were in their rooms. Leo building with his blocks, Evie lost in her books. The quiet gave her mind too much space to wander back through time. She sank into her worn armchair, the one Maya used to curl up in during those final months. The evening light filtering through the thin curtains cast the same shadows it had back then. Ruth closed her eyes, and the memories washed over her like waves. Maya had come home late most nights, her maid's uniform crisp in the morning but wrinkled by evening. "Just tired, Mama," she'd say, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Ruth had assumed it was the long hours at the Reed mansion, the physical toll of cleaning and serving. But there had been other signs she hadn't pieced together until now. The way Maya would sometimes hum while folding laundry, lost in thought with a secret smile. The careful way she'd dodge questions about her day. The times Ruth caught her writing letters late at night, only to find the wastepaper basket filled with crumpled papers the next morning. "Oh, my sweet girl," Ruth whispered to the empty room. "You carried so much alone." She remembered the morning Maya announced she was leaving her job at the Reeds. Her daughter's hands had trembled as she'd packed her uniform away, but her voice had been steady. "It's just time for a change, Mama, that's all." Ruth stood up, her joints protesting as she made her way to the hall closet. On the top shelf, behind a stack of old blankets, sat a shoebox she hadn't opened in years. Inside were Maya's things. Photos, her favorite scarf, the small diary she'd kept. Ruth had never read it, respecting her daughter's privacy even after death. Now, she carefully opened the worn cover. The pages were filled with Maya's flowing handwriting, but what caught Ruth's eye were the pressed flowers scattered throughout, tiny dried blooms that must have come from the Reed Gardens. Between entries about daily work were hints of stolen moments. A shared laugh over spilled tea, a brush of hands while passing serving trays, quiet conversations in the greenhouse. "He was so different from what everyone said," one entry read. "He sees me, Mama. Not just the uniform, but his mother." The rest of the page was torn out. Ruth's vision blurred with tears. She thought of Thomas today, the raw pain in his eyes when Leo had whispered those words. He hadn't known. All these years, he hadn't known about her grandson, his son. In the kitchen, Ruth filled the kettle with shaking hands. The familiar ritual of making tea helped steady her nerves as she tried to sort through her tangled emotions. Anger rose first, at the elder Mrs. Trade. Reed, at a world that had forced Maya to choose between love and survival, at herself for not seeing her daughter's pain sooner. But beneath the anger was something else. She thought of Thomas on their picnic blanket, his gentle way with the children, how his loneliness had matched their own. The way he'd funded their art camp without fanfare or expectation. Was that the same man Maya had written about in her diary? The one who'd seen past her uniform to her heart? Ruth carried her tea to her bedroom and knelt beside her bed. The worn carpet was soft under her knees, padded by years of prayers. She clasped her hands, but the words wouldn't come at first. "How did you ask for guidance when the past and present collided so violently?" "Lord," she finally whispered. "My Maya kept so many secrets to protect us. Now, I don't know if I should do the same." She thought of Leo's eager face when he'd shared his mother's whispered truth, of Evie's delight in finding someone who matched her curiosity about books and gardens. "These children need protecting," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "But maybe they need more than just my protection. Maybe they need the chance Maya never had." The tears came freely now, dropping onto her clasped hands. "Show me how to be both wise and gentle. Show me how to guard their hearts while leaving room for grace." Ruth stayed there a long while, listening to the quiet sounds of her grandchildren's play down the hall. The evening light faded to dusk, and still she knelt, caught between the weight of the past and the uncertainty of tomorrow. The evening sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Church, painting the garden path in gentle hues of amber and blue. Ruth sat on a weathered wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she watched Thomas Reed approach. He walked with measured steps, his usual confident stride replaced by something more hesitant. "Mrs. Ellison," he said softly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Thank you for meeting me here." Ruth nodded, gesturing to the empty space beside her. "Pastor Irene said we could use the garden. It's peaceful here." Thomas settled onto the bench, maintaining a careful space between them. The garden's roses bobbed in the breeze, their sweet fragrance filling the silence between them. A bird chirped somewhere overhead, its song echoing off the church's brick walls. "I need to know," Thomas finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About Leo. About Maya." His hands gripped his knees. "I understand if you don't trust me, but—" "I trusted Maya," Ruth interrupted gently. "And she never spoke of you. There must have been a reason." Thomas's shoulders sagged. "We were young. I loved her, Mrs. Ellison. But my mother—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Things happened that I didn't understand then. Letters disappeared. Maya stopped coming to work one day, when I tried to find her. She was already gone," Ruth finished, remembering those difficult months. "She came home so tired, so quiet. Then she left town for almost a year." Her voice softened. "When she came back, she had Leo." "A paternity test," Thomas said carefully. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I need to know, and I think maybe Leo needs to know too." Ruth turned to study his face. The wealthy businessman was gone, replaced by someone raw and uncertain. She saw echoes of Leo in the way he held his hands, in the slight furrow of his brow. "This isn't about money," she said firmly. "Those children are my world, Mr. Reed. Their dignity comes first. Their peace of mind comes first." "Of course," Thomas agreed quickly. "Everything would be completely private. My personal physician can arrange it discreetly. No one needs to know until—" He trailed off, looking lost. "Until we know," Ruth finished. She took a deep breath, smoothing her skirt. "And if the test is positive, what then?" "Whatever you allow," Thomas said quietly. "Whatever is best for Leo. For both children. I know I have no right to make demands, but if he's my son—" His voice cracked slightly. "I've missed so much already." Ruth thought of Leo's drawings on the refrigerator, stick figures of a family, always with a space where a father should be. She thought of Maya's smile in that old photograph, so young and bright. "We need rules," she said finally. "Boundaries." Thomas nodded eagerly. "Anything you say. Until we know for certain, you're just Mr. T to the children. A friend who sometimes joins us at the park. Nothing more." Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. "No hints, no promises, no expectations. They've had enough uncertainty in their lives." "I understand completely," Thomas said. His relief was visible, as if he'd expected to be turned away entirely. "Just being able to see them, to know them a little, it's more than I hoped for." "And no money," Ruth added. "Not beyond what you've already done with the art camp. We don't need your charity, Mr. Reed." "Thomas," he corrected softly, "please, and I respect that. I'm not trying to buy my way in, Mrs. Ellison. I just want—" He looked at the church garden, at the simple beauty of the flowers and vines. "I want to know the truth. And maybe, if it's God's will, to be part of their lives in whatever way you think is best." Ruth felt something in her heart ease slightly. His humility felt genuine, his pain real. She remembered Maya's words about always following where grace led, even down unexpected paths. "We'll take the test," she said, "and then we'll see what God has in store for all of us." Thomas stood slowly, as if afraid to break the fragile agreement between them. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellison. I'll have my physician contact you with the details." "Ruth," she offered, surprising herself. "If we're going to do this, you might as well use my first name." He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "Thank you, Ruth, for giving me this chance." She watched him walk away through the garden, his shoulders straighter now, but still humble. The evening light caught the silver in his hair, and for a moment Ruth could see what Maya might have seen in him all those years ago. Not the wealthy man, but someone capable of great gentleness. Looking up at the church's cross silhouetted against the darkening sky, Ruth whispered a quiet prayer for guidance. Whatever came next, she knew they would need it. The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the fog when Ruth first noticed the stairs. She was picking up day-old bread from Anderson's bakery, just like every Tuesday, when Mrs. Anderson's usual warm smile seemed a touch too bright, too knowing. "Lovely morning for a walk in the park, isn't it, Mrs. Blank?" Anderson's eyes twinkled as she added an extra Danish to Ruth's bag. "I hear the benches by the children's garden are especially nice these days." Ruth's cheeks warmed, but she kept her voice steady. "The children do enjoy the flowers there." Outside the bakery, two women huddled near the newspaper stand, their heads bent close together. They straightened up when Ruth passed, their conversation dropping to whispers. One clutched her pearls, the other's eyebrows raised so high they nearly touched her hairline. At the grocery store, Ruth could feel eyes following her down every aisle. Betty Chen, who'd worked the checkout counter for 20 years, actually stopped scanning items midway through Ruth's order. "Is it true?" Betty leaned forward, her voice hushed. "About you and Thomas Reed?" Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she counted out her coupons. "I'm not sure what you mean, Betty." "Well, Sarah, from the library, saw you two talking in the church garden yesterday, and Mary's daughter swears she saw his car outside your house last week." Ruth carefully placed her groceries in her worn canvas bag. "Mr. Reed has been kind enough to support the children's summer programs," she said simply. The whispers followed her all the way home. Outside the post office, she overheard snippets that made her stomach clench. "Always knew there was something about that Maya girl, and probably planned it all along." Leo and Evie were at their morning art camp, thank heavens. Ruth set her bags down on the kitchen counter and sank into a chair, her shoulders heavy. The phone rang, making her jump. "Ruth?" It was Margaret from her church circle. "I'm just calling because I care about you, dear. People are talking, and well, Thomas Reed isn't exactly the kind of man who associates with. I mean, given your situation." "Thank you for your concern, Margaret." Ruth cut in firmly, though her voice shook. "I need to start lunch now." She hung up before Margaret could respond. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Ruth grabbed her purse and headed for the one place she knew she could breathe: St. Mark's Church. The old wooden doors creaked welcome as she slipped inside. The familiar smell of lemon polish and aged hymnals wrapped around her like a hug. She made her way to her usual pew, the third one from the back, where she'd sat every Sunday for 40 years. "I thought I might find you here." Pastor Irene's gentle voice came from behind her. The pastor settled beside Ruth, her presence steady and calm. "Would you like to talk about what's troubling you?" Ruth's carefully maintained composure cracked. "The whole town's talking, Pastor. They're making assumptions about Maya, about me." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Some are saying I'm trying to trap Mr. Reed for his money. Others are suggesting worse things about Maya's character." Pastor Irene nodded, her eyes kind. "Small towns run on gossip like cars run on gas. But gossip burns out eventually, leaving only what's real behind." "I don't know what's real anymore," Ruth admitted. "Thomas seems sincere in wanting to know about Leo, but—" She twisted her handkerchief in her lap. "My daughter kept secrets, big ones. And now those secrets are sprouting legs and running all over town." "Maya had her reasons," Pastor Irene said softly. "And you have yours for handling this situation carefully. The truth isn't always simple, Ruth, but it is always perfect in God's timing." Ruth thought of Leo's innocent face, of Thomas's haunted eyes when he saw Maya's picture, of all the years of silence and separation. "I'm trying to protect my grandchildren," she whispered. "But maybe I'm also afraid of what else we might discover." Pastor Irene placed a weathered hand over Ruth's fidgeting ones. "Truth has a way of walking itself home," she said with quiet certainty. Ruth exhaled slowly, bracing herself for what lay ahead. The evening light slanted through the church's basement windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Ruth adjusted her apron and watched as Thomas Reed stood awkwardly at the serving station, his expensive wool sweater rolled up at the sleeves, looking distinctly out of place among the dented soup pots and mismatched ladles. "Here," Ruth said, demonstrating the proper technique. "You need to dip and twist, or it'll splash everywhere." She showed him how to smoothly scoop the thick vegetable soup without dripping. Thomas's first attempt sent drops of broth splattering across the metal counter. His cheeks flushed pink. "I'm afraid I'm not very practiced at this," he admitted quietly. "Nobody's born knowing how to serve soup," Ruth assured him. "My first day in the school cafeteria, I wore more food than I served." A small line had formed, mostly regulars from the neighborhood. Old Mr. Jenkins, who always came early, shuffled forward with his bowl. Thomas concentrated hard, his tongue caught between his teeth as he carefully filled the bowl. "Thank you, son," Mr. Jenkins said, peering up at Thomas. "Say, weren't you in the service? Something about that stance of yours." Thomas straightened slightly. "Yes, sir. Marines? 20 years ago now." "Thought so." Mr. Jenkins brightened. "I was Army myself, 69 to 73. Where were you stationed?" As Thomas answered, his movements became more natural. His shoulders relaxed, and the ladle found its rhythm. Ruth noticed how his eyes lit up when Mr. Jenkins shared a story about his own deployment, and soon other veterans in line joined the conversation. "You should have seen the mess hall in Kuwait," Thomas was saying, ladling soup smoothly now. "The sand got into everything. We'd crunch our way through meals like we were eating at the beach." Laughter rippled through the line. Even little Joey Martinez, who usually hid behind his mother's skirt, giggled and held up his bowl without prompting. "Mr. T makes funny faces," Joey announced to Ruth, as Thomas crossed his eyes and pretended the ladle was too heavy. More families filtered in as the evening progressed. Ruth moved between the kitchen and serving area, replenishing bread baskets and stirring pots. Each time she passed, she noticed Thomas growing more comfortable. He learned everyone's names, remembered who liked extra crackers, and kept the line moving with gentle efficiency. When Sergeant Williams rolled in with his wheelchair, Thomas immediately came around the serving station to carry his bowl to a table. The two men fell into easy conversation about training camps and drill instructors, their laughter mixing with the general din of the supper hour. "Been a while since we've seen Williams smile like that," Mrs. Chen observed as she helped Ruth wash dishes. "Your friend there has a good way about him." Ruth watched Thomas demonstrate a proper salute to a cluster of wide-eyed children, their plastic bowls temporarily forgotten. His wealth and status had vanished into the simple act of serving others. Here, under fluorescent lights and surrounded by mismatched chairs, he looked more at ease than he had on that park bench in his tailored clothes. She remembered Maya mentioning once that the young man she'd met seemed lonely despite his big house. Now, seeing Thomas swap stories with the veterans and charm the children, Ruth understood. His money had built walls, not bridges. But here, ladling soup and breaking bread, he was just another soul seeking connection. The evening wound down as the last stragglers finished their meals. Thomas helped stack chairs, ignoring Ruth's protests that guests didn't need to clean up. She noticed his hands were slightly reddened from hot bowls and soapy water, but his smile remained genuine. At a corner table, 3 retired servicemen still sat with Thomas, sharing coffee and comparing notes about bases where they'd served. Their animated voices echoed in the emptying hall. Ruth saw how Thomas leaned forward, engaged and present, no trace of the reserved millionaire who'd first approached their picnic blanket. "Thank you for letting me help," he said later, as Ruth handed him his coat. "I haven't felt this useful in a long time." Ruth nodded, understanding that some hungers ran deeper than soup could fill. She watched him join the veterans heading out into the evening, their easy camaraderie evident in their matched strides and shared laughter. In that moment, she saw past the wealthy benefactor to the man himself, someone who had served his country, lost his love, and somehow ended up alone despite all his success. The late morning sun warmed Ruth's small kitchen as she wiped down the counter, humming an old hymn. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her routine. Opening it, she found an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes standing on her porch, wringing her hands nervously. "Mrs. Ellison? I'm Martha Wilson. I used to work at the Reed estate as a housekeeper." The woman's voice quavered. "May I come in? There's something you need to know about Maya." Ruth's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her daughter's name. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Please, sit down. Would you like some tea?" Martha nodded gratefully, settling into one of the worn wooden chairs. Ruth busied herself with the kettle, trying to steady her trembling hands. When she finally sat down across from Martha, 2 steaming mugs between them, the older woman's eyes were filled with tears. "I've been carrying this burden for too long," Martha began, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "When I heard the whispers about Thomas Reed spending time with your family, I knew I had to come forward." Ruth leaned forward, her throat tight. "What burden, Mrs. Wilson? I was there, you see. I worked in that house when Maya was a maid." Martha's voice grew stronger with determination. "Mrs. Reed, Thomas's mother, she was a force to be reckoned with. When she discovered Thomas and Maya were getting close, she was furious." Ruth's hands clenched around her mug. "Go on." "One afternoon, I was dusting in Mrs. Reed's study when Maya came in. Mrs. Reed had summoned her." Martha closed her eyes, recalling the scene. "She had a checkbook out on her desk. I wasn't supposed to hear, but I couldn't help it. The words were so cruel." Ruth could picture it clearly, her beautiful Maya, standing straight-backed in her uniform, facing down the formidable Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed told Maya that people like her weren't meant for people like Thomas. Said it would ruin his future, destroy the family name. Martha's voice cracked. "She wrote a check, a large one, and told Maya if she didn't take it and disappear, she'd make sure Maya never worked again in this town or any other." The kitchen seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. Ruth's chest ached with each breath. "But that's not all," Martha continued, pulling a tissue from her pocket. "There were letters, so many letters. Maya wrote to Thomas every week for months after she left. And Thomas wrote back. But Mrs. Reed intercepted all of them. I saw her burning them in the fireplace, one by one." Ruth stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. "My daughter, my Maya." She thought he'd forgotten her. "Thomas never knew about the letters," Martha said softly. "Mrs. Reed told him Maya had simply moved on, found someone else. She made sure they both believed the worst of each other." Ruth's shoulders began to shake. "She was so quiet those last months, so sad. I thought maybe she'd had her heart broken. But this." She turned back to Martha, tears streaming down her face. "She was protecting her baby, protecting all of us." Martha stood, her own eyes wet. "I should have spoken up back then. But Mrs. Reed, she had ways of making people stay quiet. I was a widow with 3 children to feed. I couldn't risk losing my job." She reached for Ruth's hand. "I'm so sorry. I've prayed for forgiveness every day since." Ruth squeezed the older woman's hand. "Thank you for telling me now. Thank you for giving Maya her voice back." After Martha left, Ruth drove to the church, her vision blurred with tears. She found Pastor Irene in her office, reading her Bible in the afternoon light. One look at Ruth's face, and the pastor was on her feet, gathering her into a warm embrace. "What is it, dear one?" Pastor Irene asked, leading Ruth to a chair. Ruth's words came out in broken sobs. "Maya, she didn't abandon anyone. She was forced away, paid to disappear. All those letters, burned. Because she wasn't their kind." She looked up at Pastor Irene, her face twisted with grief and rage. "It wasn't abandonment. It was stolen love." Pastor Irene held Ruth's hands as she wept, her tears falling for her daughter, for Thomas, for all the years lost to prejudice and pride. The afternoon light dimmed in the office, but still Ruth cried, mourning the truth that had finally come to light. The morning dawned gray and chilly, matching the somber mood as Ruth helped Leo button his coat. She smoothed his collar with trembling fingers, trying to keep her movements steady and calm, despite the anxiety churning inside her. "Why do we have to go to the doctor, Grandma?" Leo asked, his brown eyes wide with curiosity. "I'm not sick." "No, sweetheart, you're not sick," Ruth assured him, tucking his scarf more securely around his neck. We're just going to do a special test today, like when you take spelling tests at school, except this one doesn't need any studying. Evie looked up from where she sat on the couch, her legs swinging. Is it because of Mr. T? Ruth took a deep breath. Yes, honey. Mr. Thomas will meet us there. The drive to the clinic took 20 minutes, their old car humming along quiet streets. Ruth gripped the steering wheel tightly, remembering Maya's face in that photograph. Her daughter's bright smile, forever frozen in time, seemed to hover in her mind. Thomas was already waiting when they arrived, standing beside his sleek black car in the small parking lot. He wore a simple sweater and khakis today, instead of his usual suit, and somehow that made him look more human, more vulnerable. "Good morning," he said softly, nodding to Ruth before smiling at the children. "Hello, Leo. Hello, Evie." The clinic was modern but discreet, tucked away in a professional complex. The receptionist led them to a private waiting area, away from other patients. Leo sat between Ruth and Thomas on the cushioned bench, swinging his feet and humming to himself. A nurse called them back, her manner professional but gentle. She explained the procedure in simple terms, showing Leo the cotton swab they would use. "It's just like a Q-tip," she said, demonstrating how she would rub it inside his cheek. "No needles, no pain, easy as pie." Leo giggled when the swab tickled his mouth. Thomas went next, his movements stiff with tension, but his eyes never leaving Leo's face. Ruth watched them both, her heart aching with the weight of years lost and truths hidden. The actual collection took less than 5 minutes. As they walked back to their cars, Thomas cleared his throat. "Ruth," he said quietly while the children examined a butterfly near the sidewalk, "I want you to know, regardless of what the results show." "Not here," Ruth interrupted gently. "Not with them listening. We'll talk when we know." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Before leaving, he reached into his car and pulled out 2 small paper bags. "I hope it's okay," he said, handing them to the children. "Just some books from the store," Leo mentioned, enjoying stories about dinosaurs. Leo's face lit up as he peeked inside his bag. "Cool! Look, Grandma! It has T-Rex teeth!" Ruth watched Thomas drive away, noting how he glanced in his rearview mirror one last time. The man who had seemed so distant that first day in the park now looked at her grandson with such yearning it made her chest tight. That evening, after Evie had fallen asleep on the couch reading one of her new books, Ruth sat with Leo in his bedroom. He was already in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed giraffe as she tucked him in. "Grandma?" His voice was small in the dim light. "What if the test says Mr. T isn't my daddy?" Ruth's heart clenched. She sat on the edge of his bed and took his small hand in hers. His fingers were so much like Maya's, artist's hands, her daughter had called them. "Listen to me, sweetheart," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Whatever that paper says, you are already loved. So very loved." Leo's eyes were serious as he looked up at her. "By you, by me, by your sister, by our whole church family," Ruth assured him. "And by Mr. Thomas, too. He cares about you no matter what that test says. Promise?" "I promise." Ruth leaned down and kissed his forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of his shampoo. "Now close those eyes and get some sleep. God's got us in his hands, baby. Always has, always will." She sat there holding his hand until his breathing evened out in sleep, her own heart full of prayers and hopes she couldn't yet voice aloud. The days after the clinic visit stretched like taffy, sweet with small moments but pulled thin with waiting. Ruth found herself checking her phone more often than she'd care to admit, though she tried to keep her routine steady for the children's sake. On Tuesday morning, while Ruth was sorting through coupons at her kitchen table, a gentle knock echoed through the house. She opened the door to find Thomas standing there, holding a small toolbox. "I noticed the front gate was sticking yesterday," he said, his voice carrying that formal politeness that seemed to soften only around the children. "Thought I might take a look if you don't mind." Ruth hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "That's kind of you. It's been catching since spring." She watched as Thomas worked, his expensive watch carefully removed and tucked in his pocket, his sleeves rolled up with surprising practicality. The gate's hinges squealed in protest as he adjusted them. "Grandma?" Leo called from inside. "Can Mr. T stay for lunch?" Ruth saw Thomas pause, his hands stilling on the wrench. She knew that look, the careful hope he tried to hide whenever the children reached for him. "We're just having sandwiches," Ruth said, her voice gentle, "but you're welcome if you'd like." The kitchen felt different with Thomas there, less empty somehow. Evie showed him how to cut the crusts off Leo's sandwich the right way, and he followed her instructions with endearing concentration. Wednesday brought rain, and an unexpected call from the grocery store. Ruth's order was ready for pickup, but her usual ride had canceled. Before she could start working out alternatives, Thomas's car pulled up outside. He didn't make a fuss about it, just helped load the bags and listened to Leo's endless story about dinosaurs from the back seat. On Thursday, Ruth found Thomas and the children in the garden, all three of them muddy-kneed and grinning. They'd been weeding the tomato patch, though Ruth suspected more dirt had ended up on them than in the proper places. "Look what Mr. T showed us, Grandma." Evie held up a earthworm with gentle fingers. "He says they're garden helpers." Ruth watched Thomas teach them how to return the worm safely to the soil. His patience with their questions reminded her of Maya, that same quiet way of making others feel heard. The hours ticked by with aching slowness. Ruth caught herself staring at family photos, tracing Maya's smile with her fingertip, wondering what she would think of all this. The uncertainty wrapped around them like morning fog, not quite lifting even as they went about their days. Friday evening settled in with the same heavy warmth that had marked the whole week. Ruth had just finished helping Leo with his bath, his hair still damp as she tucked him into bed. Evie was sprawled on the living room floor with her drawing pad, sketching what looked like a family of stick figures under a bright yellow sun. The phone's ring cut through the peaceful scene like a thunderclap. Ruth's hand trembled as she reached for it, recognizing the clinic's number. She glanced at Evie, still absorbed in her artwork, and stepped into the kitchen. "Mrs. Ellison?" The nurse's voice was clear and professional. "The results are ready." The morning sun filtered through Pastor Irene's office windows, casting long shadows across her worn wooden desk. Ruth sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Thomas perched stiffly in the chair beside her. Between them, a crisp white envelope lay unopened on the desk. Pastor Irene's gentle voice broke the silence. "Would you like me to step out?" Ruth shook her head quickly. "No, please stay." Her voice wavered slightly. "We might need your wisdom after we know." Thomas hadn't moved, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if it might vanish if he looked away. His usually impeccable suit seemed to hang differently on his frame today, as though the weight of anticipation had pressed out its careful creases. "Shall I?" Ruth reached for the envelope, but her hand trembled. "Together," Thomas suggested softly. He placed his hand next to hers, and they carefully broke the seal. The paper inside was clinical and stark, filled with medical terminology and percentages. Ruth's eyes scanned the page, searching for the conclusion. Beside her, she heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath as he found it first. "Probability of paternity, 99.99%, he read aloud, his voice cracking on the numbers. Ruth felt the room tilt slightly. She gripped the edge of Pastor Irene's desk, steadying herself. All these years, Maya's secret had been locked away in her heart, and now here it was, in black and white. "It's true then," she whispered. "Maya never told you, but she knew. She always knew." Thomas's hands shook as he carefully folded the paper. "I would have," he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "If I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to be there for them both." Pastor Irene leaned forward, her weathered face full of compassion. "The past is past, Thomas. What matters now is what you choose to do with this truth." Ruth watched as Thomas stood and walked to the window. His reflection showed tears tracking silently down his cheeks. "I have a son," he said, wonder breaking through the formal facade he usually wore. "All these years of empty rooms in that big house, and I had a son." "Leo is a special boy," Ruth said softly. "He has Maya's heart, sees straight through to the good in people." Thomas turned back to face them. Would you allow me to be part of his life? Really be part of it, not just as Mr. T who sits on park benches?" Ruth felt tears welling up in her own eyes. Maya would have wanted that. She never spoke ill of you, even at the end. She just said sometimes love gets tangled up in things bigger than itself. Your mother, Ruth continued, her voice strengthening. She's the one who made those tangles, isn't she? Thomas nodded, pain etching deeper lines around his eyes. I didn't know then what she'd done. By the time I found out, Maya was. He couldn't finish the sentence. Pastor Irene reached across her desk, taking one of Ruth's hands and one of Thomas's. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she said. Sometimes the longest road leads us right back home. Ruth closed her eyes, letting a prayer of gratitude rise up from her heart. The truth was out now. No more secrets, no more wondering. Leo had a father who wanted him, who had loved his mother, who had been searching for connection all these years without knowing what he'd lost. When she opened her eyes, she saw Thomas had sunk back into his chair. His usual, carefully maintained composure had crumbled completely, replaced by raw emotion she'd never seen on his face before. I finally have a son, he whispered, the words carrying decades of longing. I finally have a son. Ruth watched him, this wealthy man brought low by love, and felt the last of her reservations beginning to soften. Maya had seen something in him once, something true and good beneath the Reed family name and fortune. Maybe it was time to let that truth come to light again. The late spring breeze carried the scent of lilacs across the lake as Thomas crouched beside Leo, carefully selecting flat stones from the water's edge. Ruth sat on a weathered wooden bench nearby, her worn Bible resting in her lap as she watched them. Like this, Leo, Thomas demonstrated, drawing his arm back. You want the stone to kiss the water, not splash into it. He flicked his wrist, and the stone skipped 4 times across the glassy surface before sinking. Leo's eyes widened. Wow, let me try, Mr. T. The 5-year-old grabbed a stone, his little face scrunched in concentration. Ruth dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her cardigan. These simple moments, watching her grandson learn from his father, filled her heart with a mixture of joy and sadness. Maya should have been here to see this. Remember to bend your knees, Thomas coached gently. That's it. Leo's first attempt plopped straight into the water with a splash, but his infectious giggle echoed across the lake. Again, he demanded, already searching for another stone. From her perch on a nearby rock, Evie watched with careful eyes, her protective nature slowly softening as she observed Thomas's patient instruction. She'd been more cautious about accepting him, but even she couldn't deny the genuine warmth in his interactions. You're doing great, buddy, Thomas encouraged as Leo's next throw managed one skip. The boy jumped up and down, pointing excitedly. Grandma Ruth, did you see? Did you see? Ruth nodded, her smile tender. I sure did, sweetheart. You're becoming quite the expert. As the morning wore on, Leo's throws improved, and Thomas's designer slacks got increasingly muddy from kneeling in the dirt. He didn't seem to mind one bit. Later that afternoon, they gathered in Ruth's modest kitchen. The countertops might have been worn, but everything gleamed with care. Evie had insisted on teaching Thomas the proper way to make a Ruth-style peanut butter and jelly sandwich. First, she instructed seriously, standing on her step stool. You have to spread the peanut butter all the way to the edges. Grandma Ruth says no one should get a bite without peanut butter. Thomas listened with endearing concentration, following her directions exactly. His large hands, more accustomed to signing contracts than making sandwiches, moved carefully as he spread the peanut butter. Now the jelly goes in the middle, Evie continued, and you spread it out slow, so it doesn't mix too much with the peanut butter. Ruth leaned against the doorframe, watching. There was something deeply touching about seeing this wealthy man, who could afford the finest restaurants in the world, taking such care to learn their simple family traditions. Like this? Thomas asked, showing Evie his handiwork. She inspected it critically. Pretty good for a beginner, she declared, causing both Ruth and Thomas to chuckle. Leo, sitting at the kitchen table with his crayons, looked up. Can we make extra for tomorrow's picnic? Of course, Thomas replied, already reaching for more bread. I'm getting lots of practice. They spent the rest of the afternoon making sandwiches and sharing stories. Thomas told them about his own childhood picnics, though his had been formal affairs with silver cutlery. Leo found this hilarious, especially when Thomas admitted he'd once gotten in trouble for using a fancy fork to dig for worms. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the kitchen windows, Leo tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "I made something for you," he said shyly, holding out a piece of paper. Thomas knelt down to Leo's level, accepting the carefully folded drawing. On the front, in wobbly letters decorated with crayon, it read, "Father's Day Ticket." Inside, Leo had drawn their little group, Ruth with her Bible, Evie with her books, himself holding hands with Thomas, all standing on what appeared to be their checkered picnic blanket. Below the picture, he'd written, "Redeem for one family." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. He looked at Leo, then at Ruth, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Leo," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the best gift I've ever received." Ruth felt her own eyes welling up as she watched Thomas carefully remove his pocket watch, the same one that had held Maya's photograph, and tuck Leo's drawing safely inside. Leo beamed, proud of his gift's reception. "Now you can keep us close to your heart," he declared, "just like you keep Mommy's picture." Thomas gathered Leo into a gentle hug, closing his eyes as he held his son. Over Leo's shoulder he met Ruth's gaze, and in that moment they shared a deep understanding. Whatever complications lay ahead, this simple gift, this promise of family, was worth everything. Evie, in a rare moment of openness, moved closer to them. "The sandwiches go in the middle of the blanket," she said softly, pointing to her brother's drawing. "That's the most important spot. That's where we all come together." Thomas carefully closed his watch, the precious drawing now safely stored alongside Maya's photograph. The simple tick of its mechanism seemed to count out the beats of this new chapter in their lives, marked by peanut butter sandwiches, skipping stones, and a child's crayon-drawn dream of family. Ruth watched Thomas writing another check at her kitchen table, his fountain pen hovering over the paper. The amount would surely be generous, too generous. She placed her hand gently on his wrist, stopping him mid-signature. "Thomas," she said softly, "you don't need to keep doing this." He looked up, confusion crossing his weathered face. "But the church basement needs repairs. And the children's program, money isn't always the answer." Ruth pulled out a chair and sat beside him. "Sometimes, what people need most is dignity, a chance to stand on their own feet." Thomas set down his pen, listening intently as Ruth continued. "You know what I see at the soup kitchen every week? So many single parents, just like Maya was. They're working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, but can barely make ends meet." She smoothed the checkbook closed. "Instead of another donation, what if we created something lasting? Something that gives people a chance to earn their way?" Thomas leaned forward, his eyes brightening with interest. "What did you have in mind? Remember that first day we met? Over a simple picnic?" Ruth smiled at the memory. "What if we turned the church kitchen into something bigger? A place that serves meals but also provides good jobs with fair wages. We could call it the Open Picnic." Thomas nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "A community kitchen that employs single parents." "Exactly." Ruth's voice grew animated. "With proper training, benefits, flexible schedules for childcare. Not charity, opportunity." They spent the next hour sketching plans on Ruth's old notepad. Thomas's business experience merged with Ruth's practical wisdom as they worked out the details. They would renovate the church's industrial kitchen, create a warm dining space, and set up a training program. "We'll need proper equipment," Thomas mused, making notes. "Commercial-grade everything. And a playground outside," Ruth added. "So working parents can keep their children close." As their plan took shape, Pastor Irene stopped by with coffee and immediately caught their enthusiasm. She offered guidance on permits and zoning, while Thomas made calls to his contractor friends. Word spread quickly through the town. Local businesses began offering support. The hardware store promised discounted supplies. The garden center volunteered to landscape the playground. Even the grumpy health inspector seemed touched by the vision, expediting their permits. Construction moved swiftly over the next few weeks. Ruth and Thomas supervised together, their different perspectives complementing each other. Where he saw efficiency, she saw comfort. When she suggested homey touches, he made sure they met commercial standards. The morning of the dedication ceremony arrived bright and clear. Ruth stood in the newly renovated kitchen, running her hand along the gleaming countertops. The space was transformed, professional but welcoming, efficient but warm. Large windows flooded the room with natural light, and child-height viewing windows let little ones watch their parents at work. Outside, the community gathered on the fresh green lawn. Someone had strung twinkling lights in the trees, and the local high school band played soft jazz. The first group of employed parents, 6 single mothers and 2 fathers, stood proudly in their new uniforms, ready to serve their first meal. Leo and Evie darted through the crowd, showing off their kitchen to anyone who would listen. Thomas straightened their party clothes whenever they zoomed past, while Ruth just smiled at their excitement. Pastor Irene stepped up to the microphone. "Friends and neighbors," she began, "today we celebrate more than just a new kitchen. We celebrate what happens when faith, wisdom, and resources come together in service of love." She gestured to Ruth and Thomas. These 2 people showed us that true giving isn't about handouts, it's about creating opportunities for others to give back. The open picnic will feed bodies and souls, providing good food and good work to our community. The crowd applauded as Ruth approached the ribbons stretched across the entrance. Thomas handed her the scissors, their fingers brushing briefly. She looked out at the gathered faces, friends, neighbors, and strangers, all coming together. The band played softly, children giggled on the new playground, and the smell of fresh-baked bread wafted from the kitchen. With steady hands, Ruth cut the ribbon. The morning sun filtered through Ruth's kitchen window as she poured her first cup of coffee. Leo and Evie sat at the table, munching on toast and giggling over their plans for the upcoming open picnic dedication. Everything felt right with the world, until her phone buzzed with an urgent text from Pastor Irene. "Turn on your computer. Now." Ruth's hands trembled as she opened her laptop. The local news website's headline hit her like a physical blow. "Maid's son snags millionaire. Small town gold. Digger's secret payoff." The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the linoleum floor. Evie jumped up to help clean, but Ruth couldn't move, her eyes fixed on the screen. The article was brutal. Anonymous sources claimed Ruth had orchestrated the whole thing, coaching Leo to trap Thomas Reed into accepting paternity. They dug up Maya's employment records, painting her as a calculating seductress who'd targeted the wealthy family's heir. The comments section overflowed with bile, words Ruth hadn't heard spoken aloud since her childhood in the segregated South. "Grandma?" Leo's voice quivered. "Why are you crying?" Ruth quickly closed the laptop, but her phone kept buzzing. Messages from church members, concerned friends, even Thomas's lawyer Daniela. The story was spreading like wildfire across social media. She sent the children upstairs to get ready for school, hands shaking as she swept up the broken coffee cup. Each shard felt like a piece of their carefully built piece crumbling away. Thomas called within the hour. "Ruth, I'm so sorry. We'll fix this. Daniela's already preparing a statement." "Don't," Ruth cut him off, her voice tight. "Sometimes fighting back just makes the mud stick harder." But the mud was already sticking. At school pickup, other parents whispered and stared. The grocery store clerk, who'd always been friendly now, avoided eye contact. Ruth held her head high, but each sideways glance cut deep. The online comments grew worse. People questioned everything. Why Maya had given Leo her maiden name, why Ruth had hidden him from Thomas all these years, how much money she'd demanded to keep quiet. Complete strangers dissected their lives with cruel speculation. Thomas's foundation board called an emergency meeting. Daniela warned him that donations were already being withdrawn. "The optics are terrible," she insisted. "We need to distance you from this situation immediately." Ruth watched their careful world unravel. The open picnic dedication was postponed indefinitely. Church members who'd embraced Thomas now awkwardly declined dinner invitations. Leo came home crying because a classmate had called him awful names. She was folding laundry that afternoon when the doorbell rang. 2 stern-faced women stood on her porch, clipboards in hand. "Mrs. Ellison? We're from Child Protective Services. We've received an anonymous complaint about your guardianship of Leo and Evie Reed." Ruth's knees went weak, but her spine straightened. "Their last name is Ellison," she corrected quietly. "Please come in." The social workers moved through her modest home like investigators at a crime scene. They noted the children's artwork on the fridge, inspected the pantry contents, examined school records spread on the kitchen table. "It says here you work part-time as a cafeteria supervisor," one woman said, her tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious. "How do you manage childcare expenses?" "We manage," Ruth answered simply. "We always have." They asked about Thomas's involvement, about Maya's death, about Ruth's finances. Every question carried an unspoken accusation. When they finally left, promising to be in touch, Ruth closed the door and sank to the floor. The house felt hollow, stripped of its warmth. All the dignity she'd fought to maintain, all the careful boundaries she'd drawn to protect her family, shredded by strangers who saw only what they wanted to see. She thought of Maya, of all the hopes and dreams her daughter had carried, of the secret pain she must have endured, forced to choose between love and survival. Now history was repeating itself. Prejudice and power once again threatening to tear a family apart. Ruth reached for her phone to call Thomas, then stopped. His whole life, his foundation, his reputation, everything he'd built, was being threatened because he'd chosen to love them. She couldn't bear to be the reason for his downfall. The children's voices drifted down from upstairs, and Ruth's heart clenched. They deserved so much better than this circus, this public dissection of their private joy. She'd protected them all these years. She would find a way to protect them now. Moving slowly to her bedroom, Ruth retrieved Thomas's checkbook from her dresser drawer, the one he'd left for emergencies. Every fiber of her being ached as she wrapped it in tissue paper. Tomorrow she would return it to him with a note. "If loving us costs your soul, don't pay it." She sat at her kitchen table, where just days ago they'd all laughed together over Leo's messy attempts at pancake making. The evening light cast long shadows across the floor, and Ruth felt the weight of every one of them pressing down on her shoulders. The phone buzzed again, another news alert. Ruth didn't need to look. She knew their story had already been twisted beyond recognition, their truth buried under an avalanche of assumptions and accusations. Her dignity, the one thing she'd always fought to maintain, lay in tatters around her, but she was still Ruth Ellison. And tomorrow, she would get up, make breakfast, pack lunches, and hold her head high, just as she'd taught her grandchildren to do. The world might try to shame them, but they would not be shamed. The evening shadows crept across Ruth's kitchen floor as she sat at her worn oak table, staring at the official complaint letter from Child Services. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, its crisp folds a stark contrast to the soft, lived-in comfort of her home. The accusations felt like daggers. Questioning financial stability, concerns about proper guardianship, anonymous report of exploitation. Next to the letter lay Thomas's checkbook, which he had left with her, just in case. The sight of it now made her stomach turn. The evening news droned quietly from the living room where Leo and Evie watched cartoons, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. A gentle knock at the back door made Ruth look up. Thomas stood there, his usual confident posture replaced by something more hesitant. She gestured for him to enter. "I saw the headlines," he said softly, settling into the chair across from her. "My lawyer is already working to have them retracted." Ruth pushed the checkbook across the table. "This isn't about headlines, Thomas. Look what they're saying about us online, about Maya." She turned her tablet toward him, showing the cruel comments beneath the article. Anonymous voices spewing hatred about gold diggers and convenient timing. Some questioned whether Maya had been more than just a maid, their implications ugly and painful. "I'll fix this," Thomas promised, reaching for her hand. "We can release a statement, explain everything." "Fix what?" Ruth's voice cracked. "Fix that your mother paid my daughter to disappear? Fix that these people think I raised my grandchildren just to trap you? Fix that someone's questioning my right to raise them at all?" The children's laughter drifted in from the other room, making Ruth's heart ache. She stood up, walking to the window where the first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. "Your board members are worried, aren't they?" she asked quietly. Thomas's silence was answer enough. "Daniela called me today," Ruth continued. She suggested it might be better if we stepped back. Said it would protect the foundation's reputation. Protect you. I don't care about reputation, Thomas protested, but his voice wavered. Ruth turned to face him, her expression gentle but firm. Yes, you do, and you should. That foundation does good work. But Thomas, I won't have my grandchildren grow up thinking they're somebody's shame. I won't have them reading those comments, feeling like they're less than worthy because of who their mama was. She picked up the checkbook and pressed it into his hands. If loving us costs your soul, don't pay it. Thomas stared at the checkbook, his fingers trembling slightly. Ruth, please, we can weather this storm together. Can we? Ruth's voice was tender but unflinching. Your mother already made one choice about class and color. Are you ready to stand against that same judgment now? Because I won't hide. I won't pretend. And I won't let those children feel like they need to be anything other than exactly who they are. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway made them both turn. Leo appeared in the doorway, clutching his favorite stuffed elephant. Mr. T, he exclaimed, running to Thomas. Are you staying for bedtime stories? Thomas caught the boy in a fierce hug, his eyes meeting Ruth's over Leo's head. The weight of everything unsaid hung heavy between them. Not tonight, sweetheart, Ruth answered for him. Mr. T has some important thinking to do. Thomas slowly released Leo, kissing the top of his head. He stood, the checkbook crushed in his grip, looking lost in his expensive suit. Ruth, he started. Go, she said softly. Figure out what matters most. We'll be here. Later that night, Thomas sat alone on the park bench where it had all begun. The evening was cool, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on dark cloth. He pulled Leo's hand-drawn ticket from his wallet. Redeem for one family. The childish scrawl blurred as tears filled his eyes. In one hand, he held his phone showing dozens of missed calls from board members and his PR team. In the other, he clutched that simple paper ticket worth more than all his millions. The night air carried the weight of choice, of conviction versus fear, as Thomas sat motionless between two worlds. Thomas Reed stood in the marble-lined conference room of the Reed Foundation, his reflection fractured across the polished table where 12 board members sat in stern silence. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across their concerned faces. This situation requires immediate damage control. Howard Chen, the senior board member, said. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the light as he shuffled through printed copies of the tabloid article. The Foundation's reputation. Our reputation? Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. Is that what concerns you most? Mr. Reed, Patricia Mueller interjected, her pearl necklace clicking as she leaned forward. We've built this foundation's credibility over 30 years. These allegations, they're drawing unwanted attention. Thomas placed his hands flat on the table, studying the weathered knuckles that had once gripped rifle handles in desert storms, the same hands that had recently helped Leo fly his first kite. They're not allegations. Leo is my son. A murmur rippled through the room. Barbara Whitman, who'd served with Thomas's mother on the original board, pressed her lips into a thin line. Surely there's a discreet way to handle this, a private arrangement, like the arrangement my mother made with Maya? Thomas's words cut through the air like steel. Paying her to disappear? Hiding her letters? The board members shifted uncomfortably. Most had known his mother, had attended her garden parties where Maya had served drinks with that bright smile that Leo had inherited. Thomas, Howard said softly, using his first name for the first time in years. We understand this is emotional for you. But think of the donors, the partnerships. Your mother built this legacy. My mother built walls, Thomas interrupted. He pulled Leo's hand, drawn ticket from his jacket pocket, holding it up. This is my legacy now. A 7-year-old boy who draws family tickets because he's never had a father. A grandmother working 2 jobs because prejudice stole her daughter's chance at happiness. What exactly are you suggesting? Patricia asked, her voice tight with concern. Thomas straightened his shoulders, feeling lighter than he had in years. I'm stepping down as chair of the board. The room erupted in protests and exclamations. Howard stood up, his face flushed. "You can't be serious! The Foundation needs to live up to its mission statement." Thomas pointed to the carved words on the wall. "Building bridges, healing communities. How can we claim to serve families while denying my own?" Barbara's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. "Think of the scandal, Thomas. The questions about your judgment." "My judgment?" Thomas laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. "My best judgment is sitting at Ruth Ellison's kitchen table, helping my son with his math homework. My best judgment is watching Evie read stories to the younger kids at the open picnic." He pulled out his chair and sat down, his posture relaxed but determined. "I'm not abandoning the Foundation. I'm transforming it, starting with the truth." Opening his laptop, Thomas began typing while the board watched in stunned silence. His fingers moved steadily across the keys. "To the community. 30 years ago, I met Maya Ellison when she worked in my family's household. She was brilliant, kind, and brought joy to everyone she met. We fell in love. My mother, fearing scandal and driven by prejudices of race and class, paid Maya to leave town and intercepted every letter she tried to send me. I never knew she was carrying my child. Last month, I met my son Leo and his sister Evie in the park. Through their grandmother Ruth's gracious wisdom, I've been given a chance to be the father I should have been years ago. The recent headlines and anonymous complaints against Ruth's guardianship are attempts to shame a family that deserves only respect and support. I'm stepping down as chair of the Reed Foundation to focus on what matters most: my family. The Foundation will redirect its mission to fighting the same prejudices that kept Maya and me apart, supporting single parents, and building true community across all dividing lines. Maya's light still shines through her children. Her mother Ruth models dignity and forgiveness daily. They have taught me that real wealth isn't in bank accounts or boardrooms, it's in the courage to choose love over fear, truth over reputation, and family over status. With humility and hope, Thomas Reed. He turned the laptop around so the board could read. Howard removed his glasses, wiping them slowly. Patricia's shoulders dropped their defensive posture. Barbara dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Send it," Thomas said quietly. "Send it to every media outlet that ran the tabloid story. Post it on our website. Print it in the town paper. The donors," Howard began, but his voice trailed off. "Will either stand with us in building a better community," Thomas said, standing up, "or they'll show themselves out. Either way, I'm going home to have dinner with my family." He gathered his things, leaving the board to sit with their decisions. In his office, he pressed send on the statement, then pulled out his phone to text Ruth. "I choose us. Always." The local news station's familiar jingle played as Thomas Reed adjusted his tie one final time. The small studio felt intimate, almost like a living room, with its warm lighting and comfortable chairs. His hands trembled slightly as he held the carefully written statement, but his voice remained steady. "Good evening," the anchorwoman began. "We're here with Thomas Reed, chairman, or should I say, former chairman of the Reed Foundation, who has requested this time to address recent headlines concerning his personal life." Thomas nodded, his silver hair catching the studio lights. He looked directly into the camera, imagining Ruth and the children on the other side. "Thank you, Sarah." He took a deep breath. Her name was Maya Ellison. She was love, not shame. The simple words hung in the air, powerful in their truth. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. 25 years ago, I met a young woman who brought light into every room she entered. Maya worked in my family's household, and over countless small moments, a shared laugh over spilled tea, quiet conversations in the garden, we fell in love. He paused, smoothing the paper with slightly shaking fingers. We kept our relationship private, not out of shame, but because Maya understood the world better than I did. She knew the whispers would start, the judgment would come. But we wrote letters, made plans, dreamed of a future. Thomas's eyes grew distant with memory. Then she vanished. I've recently learned that my mother, fearing scandal, paid Maya to leave and intercepted every letter between us. I never knew Maya was carrying my child. I never knew she died young, leaving behind a son I should have helped raise. In her modest living room, Ruth sat perfectly still, one hand pressed to her heart. Leo and Evie, nestled close on either side, watching their usually reserved Mr. T bare his soul to the entire town. To those who've questioned Ruth Ellison's guardianship of her grandchildren, Thomas continued, his jaw tightening slightly. You should know she has given them everything I failed to provide. Stability, dignity, and unconditional love. She has worked multiple jobs, stretched every dollar, and created a home filled with faith and joy. The camera pulled back slightly, showing Thomas's full posture, straight-backed but humble. As for the whispers about fortune, hunting, or scandal, let me be clear, Ruth Ellison never asked me for a penny. When the truth about Leo's parentage emerged, she demanded only one thing: that her grandchildren's dignity be protected. She has shown me what true wealth looks like. It's not in bank accounts, but in the courage to love without conditions. Thomas lifted his chin, speaking now with quiet authority. Effective immediately, I am restructuring the Reed Foundation. 50% of our annual grants will support organizations fighting racial and economic discrimination. We will fund educational opportunities for single parents, establish fair wage work programs, and partner with faith communities doing the hard, daily work of building bridges. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew Leo's hand-drawn ticket. My son gave me this. It says, "Redeem for one family." I intend to honor it by standing here today and choosing love over fear, truth over appearance, and family over fortune. To Maya's memory, to Ruth's strength, and to my children's future, I pledge to do better. The anchorwoman dabbed discreetly at her eyes. Mr. Reed, that's quite a statement. What would you say to those who might criticize this decision? Thomas smiled gently. I'd say that love is never a mistake. Maya taught me that. Ruth reminds me every day. And my children, his voice caught slightly, they show me what grace looks like in action. In Ruth's living room, tears streamed freely down her face. Leo squeezed her hand while Evie wrapped her arms around her grandmother's shoulders. On the screen, Thomas continued speaking, but Ruth barely heard the words. Her heart felt like it might burst with a complicated mix of pride, grief, and something that felt surprisingly like hope. She thought of Maya, her beautiful, brave daughter, who had loved this man enough to protect him with her silence. She thought of all the nights she'd questioned her own strength to raise these children alone. And now, here was Thomas, using his privilege not as a weapon but as a tool for change, choosing their messy, beautiful family over everything else. The news segment ended with Thomas looking directly into the camera one last time. To anyone who has ever felt pushed to the margins, told their love wasn't right, or forced to choose between dignity and survival, your story matters. Your love matters. And it's never too late to make things right. The screen faded to commercials, but Ruth remained seated, surrounded by her grandchildren's warm embrace, letting tears of pride and healing fall freely. The morning sun warmed the familiar park benches as Pastor Irene Cole arranged folding chairs in a wide semicircle. Her silver cross pendant caught the light as she moved with purpose, checking each detail. A simple podium stood at the center, draped with a cloth bearing the church's emblem. People began trickling in, first just a few, then dozens. Store owners closed their shops early. Teachers brought their students. Veterans arrived in their service caps. Mothers with strollers parked along the edges. The growing crowd created a tapestry of faces, dark and light, young and old, work boots alongside business suits. Ruth sat quietly in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. Leo and Evie flanked her sides, dressed in their Sunday best. Thomas stood a respectful distance away, exchanging quiet greetings with those who approached him. Friends and neighbors, Pastor Irene's voice carried across the gathering. We're here today because truth needs sunshine to grow. She gestured to the old oak tree, spreading its branches above them. Under this very tree, a simple picnic began a journey that touches us all. Thomas walked to the podium first. His usual polish had softened into something more human, his tie slightly loose, his eyes carrying both weight and warmth. I spent years building walls of wealth and reputation, he began, his voice rough with emotion. But Maya Ellison broke through those walls with nothing but her genuine heart. He paused, steadying himself. My mother saw her background, her color, as threats to our family name. She made Maya disappear, hid her letters, erased her from my life. I failed Maya by not fighting harder to find her. I failed my son Leo by not being there. But I won't fail them or this community any longer. Ruth rose next, her small frame carrying immense dignity. My daughter Maya worked honest jobs, loved deeply, and faced impossible choices. When she came home carrying Leo, she protected everyone's dignity, even those who denied her own. Her clear voice grew stronger. We're not here for revenge or riches. We're here because love deserves light, and truth deserves witnesses. Elderly Mrs. Jenkins, who had worked in the Reed kitchen for 40 years, stood up from her chair. I remember Maya's laugh in that kitchen. She made the whole house brighter. Others began standing, sharing memories. Maya helping at bake sales, Maya tutoring neighborhood kids, Maya singing in the church choir. A young mother, with a sleeping baby, stepped forward. I work at the open picnic now. My children eat well, and I can hold my head high. That's Maya's legacy too. The veterans who shared soup with Thomas at the church kitchen rose together. A man proves himself by his actions, their spokesman declared. We've seen Thomas Reed serve others with humility. That's good enough for us. Someone in the back called out, my kids are in the reading garden he built. He fixed my grandson's bicycle last week, another voice added. Remember when Maya organized the Christmas coat drive? The stories flowed freely now, weaving together the threads of community that had always been there, hidden beneath artificial divisions. Pastor Irene raised her hands for quiet. Look around, she said softly. This is what healing looks like. This is what truth does when we let it work. As if on cue, Mrs. Chen from the corner market appeared with bags of fresh rolls. The Rodriguez family brought containers of homemade tamales. The diner owner wheeled over a cart of coffee urns. More people returned with dishes from their homes or nearby shops. Blankets and tablecloths appeared on the grass. Children helped spread them out, creating a patchwork of colors across the park. The formal seating arrangement dissolved as people settled in groups, passing plates and sharing conversations. Ruth found herself seated between Thomas and Pastor Irene, watching Leo teach younger children how to make grass whistles. Evie moved from blanket to blanket, collecting stories about her mother that she recorded carefully in a notebook. The afternoon sun painted everything in gold as the spontaneous feast continued. Here sat the bank president sharing cornbread with a bus driver. There, elderly Mrs. Pronis. Jenkins taught Thomas's former board secretary her secret for perfect iced tea. Children of all shades played tag between the blankets while their parents exchanged recipes and phone numbers. Pastor Irene touched Ruth's arm gently. Sometimes Grace looks exactly like a picnic, she said, her eyes twinkling. Ruth watched her town transforming before her eyes, not through grand gestures or formal declarations, but through the simple act of breaking bread together. The memory of Maya seemed to dance in the dappled sunlight beneath the oak tree where it all began. The morning sun filtered through Ruth's kitchen curtains, casting warm patches on the well-worn linoleum floor. She had just finished arranging fresh-cut flowers from her small garden in a mason jar when the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew this was the scheduled visit from Child Services. Ms. Peterson, the social worker, stood on the porch with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She was younger than Ruth expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for accommodating this visit." Ruth smoothed her cardigan and gestured toward the living room. "Please, come in. The children are just finishing their breakfast." From the kitchen, Leo's voice rang out, "Grandma, can I have more orange juice?" "Just a minute, sweetheart," Ruth called back, her voice steady despite her nerves. She turned to Ms. Peterson. "Would you like some coffee?" "That would be lovely. Thank you." As Ruth poured 2 cups, she could hear Evie helping Leo clear his dishes, something she'd taught them both as soon as they could reach the sink. The simple sound of their cooperation made her chest tighten with pride. Ms. Peterson settled onto the couch, taking in the room. Her eyes moved over the walls covered with children's artwork, school certificates, and family photos. A recent picture showed Thomas teaching Leo how to hold a baseball bat, both of them grinning. "The children seem well settled," Miss Peterson observed, accepting the coffee. "They are," Ruth said simply. "This has been their home since Maya passed." Evie appeared in the doorway, Leo half hiding behind her. "Hi," she said politely. "We cleaned our rooms this morning. Want to see?" Ms. Peterson smiled. "I'd love to." The tour revealed neat beds with colorful quilts Ruth had made herself, bookshelves organized by reading level, Thomas's suggestion, and Leo's prized rock collection carefully labeled on index cards. Through the window, they could see the small vegetable garden where each child had their own patch to tend. "And look," Leo exclaimed, pointing to a schedule on his wall. "That's when Mr. Thomas, comes to help with homework. He's really good at math." Ms. Peterson made notes, while asking gentle questions. How did they like school? What were their favorite activities? Did they have friends in the neighborhood? The children's answers flowed naturally, revealing a life full of routine, love, and support. Evie spoke about her reading club at the library, while Leo couldn't wait to show off the model airplane he and Thomas were building. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mrs. Martinez from next door, dropping off a casserole. "For your freezer, Ruth," she said. "The church ladies are taking turns this week, making sure you have plenty of good food while all this nonsense gets sorted out." More visitors arrived throughout the morning. Pastor Irene checking in, Thomas with fresh groceries, and even Mr. Wilson, Leo's teacher, stopping by to share how well the boy was doing in class. Ms. Peterson observed it all, taking particular note of how naturally Thomas fit into the household rhythm. He didn't try to take over or overshadow Ruth's authority. Instead, he moved with careful respect for the family's established patterns, asking Ruth's permission before suggesting activities with the children. "The community support here is remarkable," Miss Peterson commented, as she watched Thomas help Leo with his science homework at the kitchen table. Ruth nodded. "We've been blessed with good neighbors. And Thomas, well, he's learning to be family the right way. No rushing, no pushing, just showing up day after day." By early afternoon, Ms. Peterson had filled several pages with notes. She sat down with Ruth at the kitchen table, while the children played checkers with Thomas in the living room. "Mrs. Ellison," she began, "I want to be direct with you. The complaint we received suggested an unstable environment due to Mr. Reed's sudden involvement and questioned your ability to maintain boundaries." Ruth's hands clasped tightly in her lap, but her voice remained steady. "I understand the concern. Change can look messy from the outside. What I've seen today," Miss Peterson continued, "is anything but unstable. These children are thriving in a home that's clearly centered on their well-being. They have routine, support, and a remarkable extended family, both blood and chosen." Relief washed over Ruth's face, but she waited for Ms. Peterson to finish. "I'll be recommending immediate dismissal of the complaint. Furthermore, I'd like to note in my report how impressed I am with the way you and Mr. Reed have handled this transition. It's not easy to build healthy co-parenting relationships, but you've clearly put the children's needs first." Thomas appeared in the doorway, having overheard. "Ruth taught me that," he said quietly. "Family isn't about power or control. It's about showing up with an open heart." Miss Peterson packed up her portfolio and stood. "Mrs. Ellison, your grandchildren are lucky to have you. All of you," she added, including Thomas in her glance. After walking Miss Peterson to her car, Ruth returned to find the children watching anxiously from the window. She gathered them both into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of their shampoo and the lingering sweetness of childhood. "We are safe," she whispered, holding them close. "We are safe!" Evie's small hands clutched Ruth's cardigan. "Does this mean we get to stay together? All of us?" Ruth looked over their heads at Thomas, who stood quietly in the background, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, warming them all in its gentle light. "Yes, sweetheart," Ruth said, her voice firm with certainty. "We are safe." The afternoon sun streamed through the industrial windows of the open picnic's kitchen, glinting off stainless steel counters and freshly washed pots. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, surprised to see Daniela Ortiz standing in the doorway, her usual sharp business attire replaced by a simple blouse and slacks. "May I come in?" Daniela asked, her voice softer than Ruth remembered from their tense meetings weeks ago. Ruth nodded, gesturing to a nearby prep table. "Would you like some coffee? We just brewed a fresh pot." Daniela's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Yes, thank you. That would be nice." As Ruth poured 2 mugs, she noticed Daniela's hands fidgeting with her leather portfolio, a nervous gesture that seemed out of character for Thomas's usually composed estate manager. They sat across from each other, the steam from their coffee rising between them like a gentle barrier. "I owe you an apology," Daniela began, meeting Ruth's eyes directly. "I was wrong to push for hiding the truth about Thomas and Leo. I thought I was protecting the Foundation's reputation, but I was really just perpetuating the same prejudices that hurt Maya years ago." Ruth wrapped her hands around her warm mug, listening carefully. The kitchen's familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant clatter of dishes, filled the thoughtful pause. "You know," Daniela continued, "my mother was a housekeeper too. She cleaned houses for wealthy families to put me through college." Her voice caught slightly. "I fought so hard to prove myself in this world of wealth and power. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what really matters." Ruth's expression softened. "We all lose our way sometimes. What matters is finding the path back to what's right." Daniela opened her portfolio, pulling out several neat stacks of paper. "I'd like to help, really help, with the open picnic. Not just with funding, but with my skills. Budget management, staff contracts, legal compliance. These are things I know how to do, and I'd like to use them to support what you're building here." Ruth studied the woman before her, seeing past the polished exterior to someone who, like herself, had known the weight of others' judgments. "You know, this isn't about charity," she said carefully. "It's about dignity. Everyone who works here earns their place." "I understand," Daniela nodded firmly. "I'm not asking for redemption. I'm asking for a chance to be part of something meaningful." The kitchen door swung open as Thomas entered, carrying a box of fresh produce. He paused, taking in the scene before him. "Everything all right?" he asked, glancing between the 2 women. Ruth smiled, warming her hands around her coffee mug. "Yes, I think it is. Daniela was just offering to help us organize the business side of things." Thomas set down the box, his face brightening. "That would be wonderful. Nobody knows these ropes better than Daniela. If Mrs. Ellison agrees," Daniela added quickly. Ruth stood, smoothing her apron. "First name's here, just Ruth. And yes, I agree, but you'll have to learn to make a decent sandwich too. Everyone here helps with the real work." For the first time, Daniela's professional mask cracked into a genuine smile. "I haven't made a sandwich since college, but I'm willing to learn." "Good," Ruth said, moving to the sink where dishes waited. "Thomas, why don't you show Daniela our filing system while I tackle these dishes?" Thomas chuckled. "Our filing system consists of recipe cards in a shoebox and receipts in a cookie tin." "Exactly why we need her help," Ruth said, turning on the warm water. As Daniela followed Thomas to the small office, Ruth heard her say, "First thing Monday, I'm bringing in a proper filing cabinet." A few minutes later, Thomas returned to the kitchen, picking up a dish towel. Without a word, he fell into their familiar rhythm, Ruth washing, Thomas drying. The comfortable silence between them spoke of trust rebuilt, of wounds beginning to heal. "You know," Thomas said quietly, carefully wiping a mixing bowl, "seeing you forgive Daniela just now, it reminded me why I fell in love with Maya. She had that same grace about her." Ruth passed him a handful of utensils, their fingers brushing briefly. "Maya believed everyone deserved a second chance. Even when people hurt her, she'd say, 'Mama, their hearts just need time to grow.'" Thomas smiled softly, remembering. She was right about that. Some hearts just take longer than others. They worked together in comfortable quiet for a moment, the only sounds the gentle splash of water and the clink of dishes. Through the kitchen window, they could see Daniela in the dining room, already taking measurements for what would probably be a very organized bulletin board. "You think she'll last?" Thomas asked, nodding toward Daniela. "Once she sees how chaotic it gets during the lunch rush?" Ruth laughed, flicking a few soap bubbles in his direction. "Oh, I think she'll surprise us. Sometimes, the most rigid tree just needs room to bend." Thomas wiped the bubbles from his shirt, chuckling. "Like how you've gotten me to bend. I never thought I'd enjoy washing dishes." "You're not washing dishes," Ruth pointed out with a grin. "You're drying them. Very different skill set." Their shared laughter echoed through the kitchen, a sound as warm and nourishing as the meals they served. Outside, the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the open picnic tables, where tomorrow, as every day, people would gather to share food and stories, their differences forgotten in the simple act of breaking bread together. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's oak trees, scattering golden leaves across the worn wooden bench where Ruth sat watching Leo and Evie play on the swings. The familiar creak of metal chains and children's laughter filled the crisp afternoon air. Thomas approached slowly, his steps measured and thoughtful, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the church kitchen. "Just the way you like it," he said softly, offering one to Ruth. "A splash of cream, no sugar." "Thank you," Ruth replied, accepting the warm cup. Her fingers brushed against his, and she noticed how his hands trembled slightly. They sat in comfortable silence, both watching the children. Leo pumped his legs harder on the swing, trying to go higher, while Evie called out encouragement. "Look, Grandma! Look, Mr. T!" Thomas smiled at the nickname that had stuck, even after all that had happened. His expression grew serious as he turned to Ruth. "This bench," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "This is where everything changed, where they invited a lonely old man to share their picnic." Ruth nodded, remembering that day. "They saw something in you before any of us knew who you were." "They saw me as just a person," Thomas agreed. "Not a bank account or a reputation, just someone who needed family as much as they did." He set his coffee down and folded his hands in his lap. "Ruth, these past months have taught me more about love and courage than all my years before." Ruth watched him carefully, noting the new lines of worry around his eyes, but also the peace that had settled into his features since he'd chosen them over his position at the foundation. "I've been thinking," Thomas continued, "about what family really means. Not what society says it should look like, but what it actually is." He paused, watching Leo jump off the swing and help Evie with her landing. "I'm not asking for marriage, Ruth. That's something neither of us is ready for." Ruth felt her heart skip, but she remained silent, giving him space to find his words. "What I'm asking for is partnership," Thomas said, turning to face her fully. "Let me help raise them, with you, not over you, never over you. You're their rock, their compass. I just want to be part of their lives, part of all your lives, in whatever way you think is right." Ruth's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "It won't be easy," she said softly. "There will always be people who don't understand." "I know," Thomas agreed. "But I've learned that doing what's right isn't always what's easy. Maya taught me that, even though I didn't understand it then." At the mention of her daughter's name, Ruth felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes. "She would have wanted this," she whispered. "She always believed in second chances." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out Leo's hand-drawn ticket. "Family," he read from the crumpled paper. "That's what he offered me. That's what I'm asking you for now. The chance to be family, however that looks." Leo and Evie's laughter rang out again as they moved to the climbing frame. Ruth watched them, these precious children who had already endured so much change. "The children need stability," she said carefully. "They need to know this isn't temporary." "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas promised. "I've already moved my office closer to town. I'm stepping back from the foundation's day-to-day operations. Nothing is more important to me than being here, being present." Ruth felt something shift in her heart, like a door slowly opening. "And the open picnic? We'll continue exactly as we planned," Thomas assured her. "Your vision, your leadership, I'm just here to support, not to take over." A cool breeze swept through the park, and Ruth found herself leaning slightly toward Thomas's warmth. He seemed to sense her movement and stayed perfectly still, as if afraid to break the moment. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, we can try this partnership." Thomas released a breath he seemed to have been holding. Carefully, tentatively, he placed his hand palm up on the bench between them. Ruth looked at it for a long moment before placing her hand in his. They sat together, watching Leo help Evie across the monkey bars, their fingers intertwined. For the first time, Ruth allowed herself to lean against Thomas's shoulder, and he held steady beneath her weight. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of hope and possibility. The late afternoon sun painted the park in warm gold, and the bench where their story had begun now held the promise of their future. Not a fairy tale ending, but something real and honest. A family being rebuilt with patience, understanding, and love. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the open picnic, casting warm light across the bustling kitchen. The aroma of fresh bread and simmering soup filled the air as volunteers and staff members moved with practiced efficiency. Ruth stood at her usual spot near the serving counter, adjusting her apron and watching the harmonious scene unfold before her. Sarah, a single mother they'd hired 3 months ago, expertly kneaded dough while teaching another young mom the proper technique. Her confidence had grown remarkably since starting work here. 2 veterans from Thomas's old unit manned the soup stations, their hearty laughter echoing off the walls as they stirred massive pots. "Miss Ruth," called 7-year-old Marcus from the reading corner. "Evie's doing the voices again." Ruth turned to see her granddaughter perched on a colorful cushion, surrounded by a half-dozen children. Evie held up a picture book, her voice changing dramatically as she brought each character to life. The children sat transfixed, even the usually fidgety ones completely still. And then, Evie read, her voice dropping to a whisper. The little mouse found something amazing. She paused for effect, making the younger kids lean in closer. The sight warmed Ruth's heart. Just months ago, Evie had been so guarded, watching everyone with suspicious eyes. Now here she was, confidently leading storytime 3 afternoons a week. The transformation wasn't just in Evie, it was in all of them. "Incoming!" Leo's delighted shriek carried through the kitchen as Thomas ducked through the doorway, the 5-year-old perched securely on his shoulders. Leo's small hands gripped his father's gray hair while Thomas held his son's legs steady. "Special delivery from the garden," Thomas announced, reaching up to help Leo hold out a basket of fresh herbs. "Chef Marcus said we needed more basil." Ruth accepted the basket, breathing in the fresh scent. "Perfect timing. The soup needs a little something extra." Thomas carefully lowered Leo to the ground, and the boy immediately darted to join the storytime group. Ruth watched as Thomas's eyes followed his son, still filled with wonder after all these months. She remembered his words from that day on the bench. "Not over you, but with you." He had kept that promise, never trying to override her authority with money or status, but instead learning from her how to truly be family. The lunch rush began right on schedule. People from all walks of life filed in: construction workers in dusty boots, office workers in pressed suits, elderly couples helping each other with their trays, young mothers with babies on their hips. Some paid the full suggested donation, others what they could, and some nothing at all. That was the beauty of the open picnic. Everyone was welcome, no questions asked. "Mrs. Ellison," called Daniela from the office doorway. "The numbers from last month are in. We're not just breaking even anymore, we're able to hire 2 more part-time positions." Ruth nodded, satisfaction filling her chest. This was what success looked like, not in dollars and cents, but in lives touched and dignity restored. As the lunch rush wound down, Thomas appeared at her side. "Beautiful day for a picnic," he said quietly. "I thought maybe." "The old oak tree?" Ruth finished his thought, already reaching for her faded checkered blanket stored beneath the counter. Word spread quickly through their regular crowd. By the time Ruth and Thomas walked to the park, others were already gathering, families with their own blankets, couples with lawn chairs, kids running ahead with frisbees and balls. Thomas carried Leo on his shoulders again, the boy pointing out clouds and birds. Evie walked beside Ruth, carefully holding the picnic basket they'd packed with leftover soup and fresh bread. Under the shade of the oak tree where it all began, Ruth spread out the old checkered blanket. Other blankets appeared around them like petals opening on a flower. Red and blue plaid, bright stripes, solid colors in every shade. The ground that had once held just their small family now bloomed with dozens of others. Sarah settled nearby with her children, sharing cookies with the elderly couple who always sat at table 3. Marcus's mother spread her blanket next to Evie's reading circle, which had transported itself outdoors. Pastor Irene arrived with her famous lemonade, and even Daniela joined them, her usual business attire replaced with casual clothes. Leo scrambled down from Thomas's shoulders to join a game of tag starting up nearby. The autumn air rang with children's laughter, adult conversation, and the simple sounds of community. Ruth looked around at the scene. At Thomas teaching a group of kids how to make paper airplanes, at Evie leading another story session on a neighboring blanket, at Leo running and playing without a care in the world. She saw the faces of people who had started as strangers and become family, the invisible walls between them slowly crumbling like the old prejudices that had once kept Thomas and Maya apart. Closing her eyes, Ruth bowed her head in silent prayer. Her heart overflowed with gratitude as she whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for making room at the table. What would you do if you were in their place?" Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ruth Ellison, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.